Welcome back to Klepper's Corner. Today in history. April 14th is one of those dates that feels like history looked at a stable political system, a crowded theater, a luxury ocean liner, and even the sky itself, and said, let's see what happens if we remove one bolt and trust the rest to vibes. Again and again, this date delivers the same lesson in different costumes. Powerful people are overconfident. Institutions are fragile, and when humanity sees a warning sign, our first instinct is often to chase it, ignore it, or print a pamphlet about how God is mad. So tonight, let's take a tour through civil wars, crusader disasters, revolutionary dreams, ecological collapse, and one extremely famous iceberg. Because if April 14th proves anything, it's that history does not ease into its drama. It kicks the door open, trips over the rug, and still somehow changes the world. Segment 1, empires built on ego and immediate regret. In 69 AD, Rome was deep in the year of the 4 emperors, which sounds less like a constitutional crisis and more like a reality show where every contestant has a legion and a personality disorder. At the First Battle of Bedriacum, Otho faced Vitellius in a clash that proved the Roman throne was no longer a sacred inheritance, but a trophy for whichever provincial army arrived angriest. Otho, a man mocked for vanity, fancy grooming, and apparently treating moisturizer like statecraft, nevertheless showed more dignity in defeat than most emperors managed in victory, choosing suicide over dragging Rome into more bloodshed. Across the centuries, at the Tarik River in 1395, Toktamish learned the other classic rule of empire: never build your power with the help of Timur, unless you enjoy discovering that your mentor is also your apocalypse. Timur crushed the Golden Horde, not just with force, but with timing, betrayal, and a post-game strategy best described as burn every trade city you can find. In both battles, empires were not undone by foreign mystery, but by the oldest human technology of all: ambition with terrible impulse control. Rome's civil war and the Horde's collapse both remind us that political order can look eternal right up until the moment somebody defects mid-battle, and the whole thing folds like a lawn chair at a family reunion. Segment 2. When knights, kingmakers, and crusaders meet the consequences of their own confidence. If arrogance were armor, the Latin knights at Adrianople in 1205 should have been invincible. Fresh off the sack of Constantinople, they had convinced themselves that God personally endorsed every bad decision they made on horseback. So when the Cuman cavalry baited them with a feigned retreat, the crusaders did what overconfident elites always do. They ignored the plan, charged into terrain they didn't understand, and discovered that mud is a very effective political equalizer. Bulgarian forces dragged armored knights off their horses with ropes and hooks, turning Europe's self-appointed warrior aristocracy into a very expensive pile of flailing metal. Then, in 1471, at Barnet, England gave us another masterclass in chaos, as fog, bad alignment, and one disastrously similar banner turned the Wars of the Roses into medieval friendly fire theater. Warwick the Kingmaker, the man who treated kings like interchangeable batteries, was undone not by some grand speech, but by confusion, panic, and his own side yelling treason because they got shot by their teammates in the mist. These battles mattered because they shattered myths. The myth of crusader superiority, the myth of perfect battlefield control, the myth that elite factions are composed of adults. Sometimes history turns not on noble destiny, but on a cavalry charge into a swamp and somebody squinting at the wrong flag through fog. Segment 3, republics, revolutions, and the dangerous hope of starting over. April 14th also belongs to revolutionaries, which is inspiring right up until the cavalry arrives from a neighboring empire. In 1775, in a Philadelphia tavern, the first American Abolition Society was founded by Quakers and allies, who decided that if you were going to talk about liberty, eventually someone in the room is going to ask whether you mean all people or just the ones who own printing presses. Their initial goal was practical, legal, and narrow, but it laid groundwork for a movement that would expose the moral contradiction at the core of the American project. Then, in 1849, Lajos Kossuth and the Hungarian Diet declared independence from the Habsburgs, borrowing the language and spirit of the American Revolution to announce that monarchy was not destiny and empire was not sacred. It was the high watermark of the 1848 revolutions, a moment when democracy looked like it might actually outrun dynastic power, before Russia showed up like the world's most aggressive hall monitor. And in 1931, Spain proclaimed the Second Republic after municipal elections made clear the monarchy had the public support of a substitute teacher on the last day before summer break. King Alfonso XIII fled. The Republic was born, and for one brief moment, democratic possibility flooded the streets. But each of these stories carries the same irony. Creating a better future is the easy part to announce and the hardest part to defend. The speech is thrilling. The declaration is glorious. And then history asks whether you brought institutions, discipline, and maybe a backup plan. Segment 4. Omens in the sky, disaster at sea, and humanity's gift for ignoring warnings. On April 14, 1561, the people of Nuremberg looked up and saw what they described as a battle in the heavens. Red balls, crosses, rods, and a huge black spear-like object hanging over the city. Today, it lives in UFO lore. But at the time, it was really an early media event, a sensational broadsheet turning atmospheric optics into moral panic. It was less Independence Day and more the sun has opinions about your sins. Hans Glaser essentially discovered that if you give people a strange sky and a woodcut, they will do the rest of the conspiracy work for you. Fast forward to 1912, and the Titanic struck an iceberg in one of history's most famous collisions between luxury branding and physical reality. The ship was sold as practically unsinkable, which is exactly the kind of phrase historians hear and immediately start writing the chapter title. The tragedy was not one mistake, but a whole choir of them. Ignored warnings, too few lifeboats, half-filled boats, radio failures, and the nearby Californian treating distress rockets like they were somebody else's problem. That is the connective tissue between Nuremberg and Titanic. Humans see signals through the lens they prefer. In one case, a weird sky became divine punishment. In the other, rocket flares became an inconvenience not worth waking the wireless operator for. We do not merely misread warnings. We customize them to fit our assumptions, which is how danger keeps winning with the exact same script. Segment 5. The night America lost Lincoln and Reconstruction lost its best chance. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, remains one of those moments where history becomes painfully intimate. The Civil War was effectively over. The country was exhausted, and Lincoln, who had carried that war like a man dragging a nation uphill by the lapels, went to Ford's Theater for a comedy. John Wilkes Booth, a celebrity actor and Confederate fanatic, slipped into the box, timed the shot to a laugh line, and changed the future in a single second. The murder itself was horrific, but the larger tragedy was political. Lincoln's death handed Reconstruction to Andrew Johnson, a man with all the empathy of a locked door and all the racial vision of a man walking backward into the future. Booth's conspiracy was also a portrait of chaos masquerading as grand design. One co-conspirator nearly killed Seward. Another was supposed to kill Johnson, but instead got drunk and wandered off, which is a darkly American reminder that some plots against democracy are terrifying and incompetent at the same time. Around Lincoln's final hours, everything feels haunted by failure. The absent bodyguard, the changed guest list, the ominous dream, the son at the bedside, the nation crossing from victory into trauma before it had even sat down. Lincoln's assassination mattered because it did not just kill a president. It crippled the country's best possibility for a more just peace. The war ended, and then the harder battle over what freedom would mean was handed to lesser men. Segment 6. When the ground turns against you and the world finally pays attention. Not all catastrophes come from emperors, assassins, or icebergs. Sometimes the disaster is a horizon you created yourself. On April 14, 1935, Black Sunday rolled over the Great Plains like the planet filing a formal complaint. After years of drought and reckless farming ripped out the prairie grasses that held the soil in place, a black wall of dust swallowed towns, livestock, roads, and daylight itself. Witnesses described midday becoming darker than midnight, which is the kind of sentence that should make every environmental policy debate a little less smug. The storm mattered because it forced the United States to admit that ecological collapse was not an abstract theory. It was in your lungs, on your dinner plate, and inside the ignition of your stalled car. And then, on April 14, 2014, Boko Haram kidnapped 276 schoolgirls in Chibok, Nigeria, exposing in the most brutal way how violence against women, education, and civilian life had become central to the insurgency's strategy. The global outrage was immediate, but outrage is not rescue, and many of those girls remain trapped by a war the world noticed only when its cruelty became impossible to ignore. These stories are different in cause, but linked in effect. One is environmental devastation, the other, human barbarity. Yet both reveal what happens when vulnerable people are left exposed by systems that failed them long before the headline. History does not only record spectacular downfalls of the mighty. Sometimes its most damning verdict is reserved for the moments when ordinary people were endangered, warned, and abandoned anyway. In conclusion, April 14th is a date that keeps exposing the same weakness in different eras. The distance between what people believe about their systems and what those systems can actually survive. Roman emperors thought armies would obey. Crusaders thought prestige would protect them. Kings thought crowns could outlast public anger. Shipbuilders thought technology could outtalk physics. Americans thought Union victory guaranteed a just peace. Farmers thought the land could be pushed forever. Governments thought schoolgirls could be left vulnerable without consequence. Over and over, history reminds us that collapse rarely arrives out of nowhere. It approaches through vanity, denial, miscalculation, and the comforting lie that somebody else is paying attention. And that may be the real theme of April 14th. Not that disaster is inevitable, but that humans are astonishingly consistent and acting shocked when the warning signs finally cash out.